en français.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marel Katsivela. I'm an associate professor at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law, Programme de Common Law Français, and I'm here today to talk to you about mass maritime autonomous surface ships, legal and ethical concerns. The findings of today's presentations are part of my articles on mass and also my upcoming book on autonomous vessels, regulatory and ethical issues. So the first legal issues we're going to talk about is the IMO scoping exercise in mass. We know that in 2021, the Maritime Safety Committee, the Legal Committee, and the Facilitation Committee of the IMO have finished their regulatory scoping exercise. And the framework of this exercise is actually to determine if the existing conventions under the scope of each committee can apply to mass. This is not a drafting exercise, it is a scoping exercise to determine under which conditions these conventions can apply to mass. 4 different degrees of mass autonomy were identified. The first 2 degrees have seafarers on board. The second degree has more automated processes than the first. And the last 2 degrees of mass autonomy that concern remotely controlled vessels have no seafarers on board, and fully autonomous vessels also with no seafarers on board. In the last level of autonomy, everything is decided and the navigation is made a reality through artificial intelligence. So the instruments examined by each committee are different, and different conclusions were reached as a result. The MSC examined SOLAS, COLREX, STCW, SAR, and other conventions like examined CLC, Fund Protocols, LMC, Salvage Convention. In the fall, examined the Fall Convention. Of course, other conventions were also examined. And the MSC decided that we need for mass and mass code a new instrument that is going to regulate mass for the conventions under its scope. This is going to be finished by 2025. Maybe it will take longer. And right now, the MSC is developing a roadmap. So if this instrument is going to be mandatory or non-mandatory, and how it's going to take effect. Whereas the LEC decided that it's not necessary to have a new code for mass for the conventions under its scope. It's just necessary to have amendments, interpretations, equivalences, but not a new code. And FAL decided something in between. It decided for the generally we need equivalences, interpretations, amendments, but for the common gaps among all the conventions, such as how do we define the remote operator? What are its responsibilities? How we define a crew and terminology in general, for common gaps to all conventions, we need a new instrument. So we'll be working on a new instrument, and it's key to in drafting this instrument and in implementing it to ensure uniformity through member states and through the industry, so insurance and classification societies as well as states, so member states. In drafting this instrument, it's very important to keep in mind that these should be uniformly applied throughout the countries. So while drafting, pay attention to this, and also while implementing, pay attention to this uniformity, which is mandatory in navigation. Is actually a big concern. For the ethical concerns in mass, we cannot talk very long, but we'll take a specific scenario in order to illustrate ethical concerns. Ethical comes from the Greek word ethos, which means value. So, do we want artificial intelligence to replace human work, and how we're going about doing it, ensuring that there is ethics, so values, human values that are respected. So if we take the example of a vessel that is an autonomous vessel that is navigating, and there is an approaching vessel that is not, or it is a mass, and our autonomous vessel is trying to determine the itinerary of the approaching vessel in order to avoid a collision. In doing this, of course, we use artificial intelligence and technology. We're going to capture through cameras and sensors everything that's around us, images and sounds, and we're going to get all this data and put it into an operating system. And all this data must be transparent and accessible, and it cannot be used to invade the privacy of persons. So imagine that our autonomous vessels in trying to determine the itinerary of the approaching vessel, capture images that may invade the privacy of the person because we capture the likeness of the person on the approaching vessel. We capture maybe a private moment of persons on the approaching vessel. This data, which contains private data of a person, has to be protected. We cannot use it for a survey later on without the consent of the person. The manufacturer of this operating system cannot use it for a survey, but this needs regulation in order to be protected. On the other hand, if there is a watchkeeper sleeping on the bridge, we want this data to be accessible and be used to prevent in the future that we have similar incidents, to ensure safety at seas. So in order to determine this fine line between which data we keep and use and which data we protect and how we protect it, we need regulation. And that's why ethics has to come into MASS in time. But we should start reflecting about it right now. And right now, there's no work done on this already. The legal work done on MASS is so much, it's taking so much time and so much effort. So ethics is not much thought of, or it's much thought of, but it's not much acted upon. But Korea, before the MSC committee in 2018, made a proposal to look into privacy issues and ethics in MASS. The Danish Maritime Authority report in 2017 made a very prolonged statement comment on the need to regulate MASS and ethics. Of course, ethics and artificial intelligence are regulated in other fields of activity, such as driverless cars, such as at the European Union level in general, but not in MASS specifically. And we need something that is uniform internationally and specific to MASS, because if something happens with invasion of privacy in MASS, we need to have a uniform regulation applying it. We cannot depend on European regulation or an American regulation or Singapore regulation. We need something more uniform. So both for legal concerns and for ethics that need to be regulated with respect to MASS, the need to ensure uniformity is always very much prevalent in this field. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm glad to take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Marel. Raised some interesting questions. Legal questions. So
very glad to meet you.
Yeah, we have a question here from Professor Rick.
Hi, interesting points, and some of the things, same things we've been wrestling with in other areas like autonomous vehicles on the road. They're not dissimilar. There are several different constraints. On the straight legal side, if you have a deterministic system managing a machine like the autopilot on an aircraft and it crashes, you can get a computer expert to go through the code and say, I can see where it went wrong. As we move to AI and machine learning, that's no longer possible. It's not deterministic. So it's essential from a legal point of view that we insist on what people are calling explainable AI. We have to essentially put the machine on the witness stand and say, okay, explain why you did that action, explain why you did that, explain why you didn't take action quickly enough. And then if I can allow me one more point on the ethical side in all this, you know, one of the big issues is public perception, both of autonomous vehicles and this. You could easily prove that the autonomous system will be 10 times safer than a manned system. And I think that's, you know, easy to establish. But if you have one accident on an autonomous system, it will be seen as a total disaster. Irrespective, you can't turn around and say, oh, well, if it had been a manned ship, it would have crashed 10 times by now. So that's part of the ethical argument. I value your comments on those 2 points.
Right, thank you, and I'm very glad to meet everybody, even though I'm so far away. It is true that, first of all, with the ethical point, I would like to start is ethics is there, and we have to develop it because even though we have all this machinery and there's not enough to go on with ethics, we need to have it, even though as you said, there'll be so much machine and they'll be able to determine so many things in that area. But in determining all these things, the machine has to have some ethical principles to go with. And that's what I think it is important to embed in these machines. For the legal aspect of what you're saying, it is true that the machines will also determine how to react and what to do. But I guess this is why the IMO is doing all this scoping exercise, because it needs to determine some legal rules to go by and to be able to see what is safe, what is not, and how much, yes, it's more safe, but if something happens and it becomes a huge problem, we need to be able to have rules to apply to these vessels. I don't know if I quite answer your questions. It is true that if mass have an accident, it will be huge, and that's what it's written everywhere. But because it's going to be huge, even though if it's safer, we need some rules, legal and ethical, to be able to react. What happens with privacy? What happens with discrimination? Because they're going to be huge when this happens, actually. I don't know if I answer exactly your questions, but I'm willing to interact more.
No, that was a good answer, Marel. Just a final comment. It strikes me in this whole area that if we're not careful, perfection is the enemy of the good. We could do very good things and they will not be perfect, but otherwise we get paralysis. We insist things have to be perfect and we don't make any progress.
Exactly. I'm very much aware of that, and I do agree with you. But we have to start somewhere, and starting with some regulation, even though in the beginning it will be chaotic and everybody will react in a wrong way, I think it's the way to start. We have to start trying, because this reality is here to stay. And even though there are hiccups along the way, like right now, we're talking more about digitalization of conventional vessels, not so much mass, but in some parts of the world, mass are developing, they'll be here to stay, and we have to start developing them, as the previous presentation and other presentations did state, but also regulating them in a way that's balancing the reality, balancing innovation and regulation. So I think we're agreeing on that, and I'm glad you kind of made that comment towards this area.
Okay, we have one more question.
Hi, thank you, Professor, for that talk and presentation. I just had a question from, I think, your second or third slide, where you mentioned the different committees of the United Nations visiting different conventions. So one comment was that, of course, the legal committee was looking at private law conventions, conventions which inherently look at the liability aspect, like salvage. And salvage itself was sort of this compromise between the ship owners and salvors as to who gets the liability for it. So it seems rather natural that UN has kind of, foregone the question of whether it will apply to mass or not. But what about MEPC? You did mention it in your slide, but you did not comment on that. So what's your take? How can MEPC come in on the mass debate or discussion?
Right. It is true that the regulatory scoping exercise is also MEPC has to comment on it. I think the understanding is that MEPC is very much loaded with work right now, with so many other work that's happening with conventional vessels and pollution standards, and it hasn't yet concluded the regulatory scoping exercise. It is huge, of course, for the MEPC to conclude that, but for now, we don't have enough elements to go on that. Of course, it is very important for MEPC to react on it, because we need also standards for pollution and mass. It's just that the work in this committee seems to be too much to have a reaction up to now in this area. I don't know if I really answered your question, but.
Okay, I think if there are no more questions, then thank you very much, Marel, and thanks for staying up late
Thank you.
to
Yeah, I
give
know.
us this talk,
It's okay.
and hope to see you again. Thank you.